Hello, folks. It's Carl from the Cambrian-AI again. You know, we always talk about hardware, and we always bring on interesting folks that are doing interesting work in semiconductors. But today, I've asked Alberto to join me. Alberto is a writer on Medium. He's got his own newsletter we'll talk about. But he's also working for us at Cambrian-AI, providing clients with some research and support. But Alberto writes mostly about software, large language models, and openness of software. So why don't we start, Alberto, with the recent controversy of that Google kind of created their own mess with whether, oh, there's my puppy dog, whether AI is intelligent. Can you kind of give our audience a quick overview of what the controversy is all about?
So, hi, Carl. And last week, it was a very viral controversy that it all started with a Washington Post article that featured one of Google's engineers named Blake Lemoine, who, after spending a few months analyzing and studying and having exchanges with one of Google's language models, concluded that the model was sentient. Okay, this post was published on Twitter, and people started talking about that, and it soon became viral because Blake Lemoine is somehow a high-profile tech person because it's from Google, and so this type of claims coming from a person that works so closely with this type of models is something to keep an eye on. Okay, something important. And so people started to talk a lot about this, having a lot of different debates and expressing their opinions. And most of the people in disagreement with Lemoine, but a lot of people also agreeing with him. And all the other tech news outlets also wrote articles with different perspectives, talking about whether we were close to building AI with sentience or not. And so this was the topic of last week's in AI. So everyone was talking about this.
Yeah, it's created quite a stir, which is why I asked for you to come on, because you wrote an interesting piece about this that took a little different perspective about the controversy. Can you share that with the audience?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to explain a little bit briefly what LANDA is, because this is a large language model, pretty much like GPT-3. I think most people will be familiar with GPT-3. And this is not a new model. This Google released LANDA, announced LANDA because it's not released publicly, last year, in May or June last year. And so it's not even their newest model. It's not the largest, it's not the best model. But the thing that Lemoine was tasked with analyzing the model, and he decided to go public with the claims and with his conversations with LANDA, because his beliefs made him conclude that it was sentient. So this is simply another large language model like GPT-3. I think the main difference is that it's specifically trained to do well on conversations, on dialogue. It's very good at handling the open-ended nature of conversations and the nuance of human conversations. So it's better at fooling humans into thinking it is better than it is when talking to it. It's better than GPT-3. So the thing is, I wrote an article and I didn't want to add to the conversation, because I think most people talking on social media were talking about their opinions. Something it is not sentient, other things it is, other things we are close or we are far. But in the end, I think we have to take some distance from the debate and analyze where we are and where do we want to go. So I wrote an article describing 3 barriers to go from the current state of, I'd say, ignorance about this topic, about AI sentience, because we don't know what sentient is, we don't know what consciousness is, and find a way to answer the questions that we have, the questions that we seek. So I described 3 barriers. I think, and this article, I think it's particularly important because a lot of people that don't have the knowledge or the expertise to build their beliefs on science will take these debates that are happening on social media and will build their own beliefs from these debates. So a lot of people are now start to think, or at least wonder if tech companies like Google are building sentient AI. So this is a problem because I think, and we will see this in the future, we will have a lot of people thinking that we have already built sentient AI way before we do. And this will be a unique challenge for the AI community. So that's why I think this perspective that I used in this article is particularly important. Okay, so the 3 barriers. The first one is, I think, the most important because it's the one we are facing right now. And is that we humans are very prone to be fooled by these language models. Okay, a lot of people, when GPT-3 came out, started claiming that it was conscious or that it was showing true intelligence and things like that. And now it's happened again with LaMDA. And the reason is that we build our beliefs with too much confidence, and we are also biased because of our different backgrounds, okay? The culture, the education, and so on. For example, in the case of Lim, he acknowledged that his conclusions, his claims, are because of his religious beliefs, not because of science, but because he believes in a particular set of things that made him believe LaMDA when the system said, I am a person, I can feel things. Okay, so in this particular case, with artificial intelligence, this type of biased beliefs have a name. It's an effect called Paraidolia. And a typical example is when you put 2 eyes in a rock and you suddenly, you know that the rock is not alive, but suddenly you can feel that it could be happy or could be sad, depending on how you put the eyes on the rock. So this is what is happening right now. We are taking a few traits, a few human traits that we are seeing in these models, and we are assuming that because these models have those traits, they also have humanness, the same way we have humanness. So this gullibility, this tendency that we have to create our beliefs and assumptions from our perception and our intuitions is a very big problem. And I think it's the main reason why Lim claimed that LaMDA is sentient. It's because he didn't use any scientific tool to conduct his experiments. He simply talked to LaMDA. He conducted a few months of conversations, but that's not reliable. That's not, you cannot repeat that experiment. You cannot, that isn't measuring anything. So I think that's the first barrier. If we keep having these debates at this level of unscientific rigor, we are going to build our beliefs on sentient AI only on our perceptions. And I don't think that's doing any good for the AI field. I think that's the first barrier. I think it's the most important. But then we have another barriers, because even if we agree that we have to do science, we have first to define and to design measurement tools. And in the case of consciousness and sentience, that's very difficult because these concepts have eluded us for centuries, I mean, for forever. And it's because the subjective nature of consciousness makes it very difficult to define. Okay, so I think the best approach is to do the same thing that Alan Turing did with the imitation game, now called the Turing test, and try to find constructs that we can define and can measure and correlate with consciousness. Alan Turing did that with intelligence, and he built the Turing test. And now, although that test is obsolete, the AI community is building updated tests to measure intelligence in machines. I think the most popular right now is called Big Bench. It's a benchmark that compiles a lot of different tests. And we could do the same thing with consciousness. We could build a measurement tool with construct validity. That means it measures what we say it measures. With reliability, which means it always measures the same thing, even if another group in another country conducts experiments. And once we have that, then we can answer the question of, okay, LANDA is or isn't sentient. We have the approach because we are doing science and we have the tools. But then I realized that there is another barrier. And this is more speculation because I'm not sure if we are going to encounter this barrier, but it's interesting to think about that. And is that even if we have the approach or the tools, we may not be able to make sense of the data that we obtain. Okay, it may not be enough. And the reason is that our cognitive capabilities as humans are not absolute, are not infinite. They are limited. So, for example, in the article I put an example of a quantum physics effect that I'm not going to explain because it's quite difficult. But the thing is that we have the theories and we have the empirical data, and those match. Okay, so we know we are doing the theories, our theories are correct and our data is measured correctly, and still we are not able to make sense of that data. We have to come up with different interpretations. Not everyone agrees. There are a lot of different interpretations for each quantum effect that we find. And this could happen with consciousness. We could have the measurement tools and the data and still not be able to answer the question what it means to be sentient or what it means to be conscious. And if that happens, we may find that consciousness is out of reach for us, even if we have the approach and the tools. So this could happen. This could happen.
Interesting. So as you're speaking, I'm wondering about the semantics, right? Do we even have an agreed upon definition of what it means to be sentient, which would then allow us to create the tests that would measure an entity, whether it's sentient or not, and determine its level of intelligence. I mean, I noticed that some of the press substitute the word soul when talking about this controversy. Does LAMDA have a soul? Wait a minute.
No.
For me, soul is very different than intelligence, and they're kind of used interchangeably. I think we're being a little sloppy with our terminology.
So that's precisely one of the problems. It's because we are throwing out those words: consciousness, sentience, intelligence, soul, and all those things. But we don't agree on definitions for those things. Not even intelligence have a consensual definition. We have to come up with different tests to measure intelligence, even in humans. The IQ test doesn't measure intelligence directly. You don't go on the brain of people and measure some things that reveal intelligence. You have to make them do some tasks. And that correlates, we assume that correlates with intelligence. So we don't have definitions for those things. We are talking about AI sentience without agreeing on a definition for sentience. And that's the second barrier. That's a problem. We cannot do science, we cannot build a measurement tool in which we all agree if we don't have a consensus on the definitions. Yeah.
So how much, I mean, does it matter? You know, I like to think in terms of practical factors. So does it provide value? Does it provide economic value? Does it provide social value? Does it make our lives better? Those things seem more important to me anyway. But what is the importance of determining whether LAMDA is this conversation even relevant?
Yeah, I agree. That's a very interesting question. I think the question of intelligence, of AGI, general intelligence in artificial, I mean, that is more important for economic value, for social value, because the idea is that if we build an artificial intelligence that is as intelligent as we are or more, we could solve a lot of problems. But a sentient AI doesn't give us the same upside, I think. I think this question is not relevant in those terms. I think it has more a philosophical relevance, more than economic or social even. But the thing is, if we eventually build a sentient AI, there will be social consequences for sure, because a lot of people will start to say that these machines should have rights, for example, that shouldn't be a property of big tech companies. So I think we have to differentiate working on AGI, on artificial general intelligence, and working on sentient AI, because I don't think any company has the objective, the goal to build a sentient AI. I don't think that's the case. The case is OpenAI, DeepMind, Google Brain. All those companies have the goal of building intelligent systems, not sentient systems. I think that's important to make it clear.
That's an important distinction. Important distinction. Well, on to other topics. We're kind of short on time, but on a more practical level, you recently published in your newsletter. By the way, you should put a link on our website to people to be able to preview and subscribe to your newsletter, because you have some very interesting topics. One of them published today I thought was very interesting, about open versus closed AI. We don't have time to go into depth, but just at a high level, can you kind of tee up the arguments you were making this morning? So
I think this topic is also important because just the week previous to this, all this AI sentient debate, we were having another debate on precisely open source AI, because a machine learning researcher decided to build a language model on top of an open source model that one of these institutions that are advocating for open source AI built, and he decided to build it intentionally for it to be as toxic as possible. Okay, and then he decided to release it on a social media platform, and then he decided to publish it on Hugging Face. So anyone could download the model and then release it again. And this article is because for the first time, I think an institution like Hugging Face, who is hosting a lot of different models, open source models, is having a problem because they have found a limitation on open source, because they open source a model and it happens that this model is causing more harm than good. Another question is, so far, companies like Microsoft, OpenAI, Facebook, Google are very, they don't want to release their models open source. Okay, now they are starting to do that, but I think it's because of the pressure of institutions like Hugging Face, but they don't want to do that. And so Hugging Face has a very particular role in this regard. And even if private AI like Google, Facebook, etc., is not the best approach, because that's not helping democratizing artificial intelligence, Hugging Face had realized that maybe absolute openness is neither the best approach because of cases like this one. Now, in that article, what I say is that we have to find the sweet spot between absolute closeness and absolute openness, and define mechanism to ensure that those models that we are going to open are going to do the most good possible, for example, intended for research, and not intended to get the worst out of the best intentions. So this is important because open source is, I think, I advocate for open source, but I think it has some, if you analyze the consequences with fine detail, you will find that in these situations, you have to come up with customized solutions. And that's exactly what Hugging Face did. They advocate for open source, but they decided to close. They blocked the model. They decided to not allow anyone to download it. And that's doing the same thing that Google and Facebook are doing in some way. They have decided that the model shouldn't be open and they close it. But my argument is that it's not the same. If you block the downloads of the model coming from open source friendliness than if you come from wanting to control your technology. I think that distinction is important. So I think open source is important, but with nuance. With nuance.
Well, I think we all have to keep in mind, like any tool, AI can be used for good or evil, for benefit or for harm, all depending on the intent of the user of that tool.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, humans are not perfect. We tend to make mistakes, have goals and desires that may harm others. So my view is not formed by a lot of experience here, but my view is that we're in for a lot of debate. The two topics,
for sure, for sure,
just the beginning, because we still are in the early days of AI. The growth rates of model size and value of model, the accuracy of these models, which is more important than the size. We're just getting started.
Right.
So the capabilities of these machines eventually could become generally intelligent, and so we need to understand and have the guidelines and the guide rails to keep us from running off the road and killing ourselves.
Yeah, that's right.
Very interesting. I look forward to continuing the dialogue with you online and offline.